So I might as well start recording, and when he comes in, we can see him. But anyway, welcome again to Whiskey Circus. Rather excited today to have 3 guests on. Still waiting for one, obviously, but we've got Sam Simmons, who most of us on the circus already know, fairly well known to most, ex-Balvenie ambassador, global ambassador, and now at That Boutique-y Whisky Company. If you want to say hello, Sam.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you again. Jens, I can smell you from here.
And then we've also, it's going to be a mad one today, so I'm not sure what to expect. And then we've also got Dave Broom. I don't really know how you can introduce somebody like Dave, one of the best whiskey authors out there, fantastic knowledge, just a proper whiskey connoisseur in my mind. So if you want to say hello, Dave.
Hello, Dave.
And just kind of give us a little bit of an intro to yourself for those who don't know. And if they don't know, then I don't know what we can say.
Yeah, well, I was born in Glasgow. I've been writing about booze since, Jesus, 1988. I've been writing about spirits exclusively since mid-90s. Written a few books, made a couple of films, live here surrounded by decoy animals and vinyl and the odd bottle of whiskey on the south coast of England. So, yeah, that's about it, really.
Yeah, I was going to say, I suppose I did miss that off, actually. Now acclaimed film star as well. They're moving to Hollywood soon.
Well, you never know. No. We are looking at, we got a couple of pictures coming up to take the Amber Light, which is a film that we made about whiskey culture in Scotland. So we want to move that on. But all of that was kind of stymied somewhat by all the shite that we're going through. But we've got a couple of pitches coming up, so we'll see what happens next year. So
I mean, I take it by when you say all the shite we're going through, we're talking about COVID rather than terroir.
Yes. Although
Yeah.
I think you could argue that shite is a huge element to play in terroir, especially in the
It's going to be one of these, isn't it? Yeah, no, I do agree with you there that, there is plenty of muck spreading when we start talking about it. And obviously us farmers put plenty of it on the land as well to start with. So, but
it was an accurate description there.
I mean, I know you do have some views, so we might as well actually start there. And then once Dr. Nick Morgan comes on, we'll probably start talking about proper things in whiskey. But, I mean, what are your views on the terroir? Because I know yours are slightly different to what the conversations generally are about terroir.
Yeah, I kind of come from a wine background anyway. So I mean, I started off writing about wine, so I'm used to the concept of terroir, and I think the concept of terroir within wine is a very fixed idea about place and soil and the grapes and the vines taking influence from that and altitude, etc. Everything will actually relate in some way or end up in some way contributing to the final flavor of the wine. I think that's a much harder concept to take whole scale from wine and apply it directly to whiskey. So I think if you are using the term terroir in whiskey, the parameters are going to be different, which is why I'm kind of reluctant to use it as a word, because I think people are then dragged down the wine route, whereas in fact, I think whiskey is talking about something else entirely. But I'm delighted that people are beginning to talk about it. And the way that I frame it is more about place. And it's more about the importance of the human influence. So terroir in whiskey is as much to do with distillery and the culture around that distillery, whether that, than perhaps directly getting flavor from the soil. And there's various ways in which you can play this. So the way that I'm looking at it is this kind of melding of a cultural terroir, if you want, but just a sense of place that a distillery will exhibit. And if you're wanting to look at it in geographical terms, I think a bi-regional approach is quite an interesting one to take, which brings into play water courses, climate, all these things that constitute wine terroir, plus human influence. Why did the whiskey styles begin to emerge? How important is culture to all of that? So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of that whole debate.
I know when I've kind of tried to look into it, because my background is farming anyway, so I would go down the line of saying the people, the stories, the provenance. That's the way I would like to see it. But trying to sort of say it's like the wine industry, when we know those vines never move, that they're in the same place, so therefore climate will change. We every year it's going to change for the barley strains and things like that. So it's hard to sort of say that it can be the barley necessarily in the land that it's grown on, rather than everything around it, but more to do with the process.
Yeah, I think it will change, to be honest. I think it's going to change fairly rapidly in the next few years. But in whiskey terms, that means in the next kind of 2 decades, really, because you're beginning to see farm distilleries starting up, and you're seeing much more investigation into barley varieties which will contribute flavour. Yeah. And also barley varieties which are being bred to suit particular climatic conditions. So my argument for years has been that, if you're wanting to grow barley successfully on Islay, you need to find a strain of barley or a cross of barley which actually suits the climatic conditions of the west coast of Scotland compared to the east coast of Scotland. Scotland's not a very big country, but you get a lot of wind. You get a lot of wind in Islay. And it's, the growing season is significantly shorter, et cetera. So are the right barley varieties being grown? So it's a flavour argument, but there's also a climatic argument as well. I think as that begins to develop, that for me is going to be a very interesting area to start exploring and see how that might manifest itself as an element within this thing that we call Whiskey Place.
That's interesting when we look at where we kind of see the industry going today. But if we go all the way back to the beginning, as to how whiskey was started to be made and things like that, it's interesting to see how far it's come on and the beliefs that have changed from back then to now, and where it might actually head in the future.
Yeah. Because there's the whole efficiency thing, and if you're a big distillery, if you're a company such as Diageo who needs to make 18 million cases liquid for 18 million cases of Johnny Walker a year, then the approach that you're going to be taking at some of your distilleries is going to be based around efficiency. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. If you're a smaller distiller who has just started up, who therefore has to demonstrate some sense of place and difference, etc., then the more focused look at what grows here and how can that assist my story, in a valid way, then that's another approach. So I think the whole argument has become too polarized. It's this kind of binary choice that which I don't think exists. You shouldn't be efficient. Well, of course you should be efficient, because you have to be efficient. How efficient should you be? There are right solutions for specific needs of some distilleries to produce higher volumes. It doesn't mean they're making bad whiskey. It just means that they're making a different whiskey to a lot of the newer distillers who are starting up. So it's not an either or thing.
I think
it's actually expanding the opportunities which exist within flavour and whiskey. And I think that is, sadly, I think that's overlooked. It's just become polarized.
Yeah, I think so much of like the conversation around sort of terroir and other more industrialized or efficient methods of whiskey production is just like so much of the discourse around anything these days. As soon as there are two differing opinions, people get put into camps where they have to be one or the other. And the reality is that the truth is often somewhere in the middle, but getting people to see that is quite difficult.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, and it is interesting looking at barley varieties, and you look at golden, everybody goes, oh, golden promise. And I do believe golden promise, has a flavor and certainly mouthfeel characteristic. But, golden promise was developed to be a higher yielding, efficient strain of barley.
Mm. Well,
and we tend to forget that. So
I mean, that's it though. When you look at all strains of barley today, they are all mutations to basically give us more yields and things like that. Gone are the days where it was probably all about flavour. It's an important factor now that we've kind of got to hit that litres per litres per ton of barley. So it's still important. Yes, the flavours are coming back, and yes, we may start to go back to look at older strains, but they're always going to be developed as well for yields.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because if you look at the barley genome, you said, obviously as a plant scientist, the strains of barley and the variations, as you were saying, the mutations. If the genome is that big, I'm trying to look what the framing is. What the industry has been using is that much, that one finger, which is disastrous given climate emergency. This is there's a multiplicity of reasons why we have to start looking at barley, and it's not just flavor. But also, I was doing a thing. I started a wee YouTube channel with Arthur Motley called The Liquid Antiquarian, which is up on YouTube. And we were looking at the 1823 Act and how that kind of fundamentally shifted the way that whiskey was made in Scotland, because nobody's actually read the Act. And if you looked at the parliamentary report which led to that Act, in 1822, I think it was, that is Scottish farmers complaining, or Scottish distillers rather, complaining about the quality of Scottish barley and the need to import English barley because it was more efficient, because they got more litres of alcohol. So this idea that it's, it was this kind of golden age, and then everybody suddenly became, no, you got to be efficient. 1820s, there are distillers going, the quality of the barley in Scotland really is not good enough for what we need to make. So, it's not a new argument.
And that's kind of a perfect thing. Now we're talking about the 1820s to kind of introduce our other guest that we've got on, because I see he's here now.
Is he that old? Jesus.
He's not that old.
So yeah, the 1820s obviously is a kind of important year in the sense we start talking about Johnny Walker and things like that. And we've actually also got on Dr. Nicholas Morgan, who is a historian and head of whiskey outreach at diageo, I believe. So hello, Nick, how are you doing?
Hi, sorry I'm a bit late joining you, but I'm doing very well. Now I'm not driving around in the fog in North Oxfordshire. I'm doing very well, thanks.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, for anybody who hasn't seen it, then that's Nick's book, and a very good book on the history of Johnny Walker. And so we might as well ask you just to give a little introduction to you and the book, and then we'll bounce it around that sort of beginning of the era and bring it forward, as well as the terroir and things like that, and diageo.
Terroir and diageo, that's two unlikely partners.
That's the face I wanted to see.
Actually, I just going to say how much I agreed with Dave's last point. Why you would think that distillers haven't always been interested in yield and efficiency, I don't know, because distillers are in business. They always have been in business. It's about making money. Part of making money is about making great whiskey, but the other part of making money is about just sweating your assets as much as you can. Always been the way. Always been the way. So just to answer your question, so I'm Nick Morgan. I have been working for United Distillers and Diageo since 1990. Prior to that, I taught Scottish history at Glasgow University, and I joined United Distillers to set up a historical archive for the company, which some people who were really, I think, very forward thinking had decided was a matter of necessity, given the fallout that was still carrying on really from the merger of the Distillers Company with Guinness in 1987, during which process a whole range of historical materials were lost, stolen, sold, taken home for safekeeping, you know, the whole range of stuff. So I was given the job of trying to put it all back together. And I did that for a couple of years, and then sort of somehow ended up in a marketing role running Diageo's single malt whiskey business, marketing director for that, which I did for quite a long time. And I suppose it would be true to say was responsible for things like special releases and all of that stuff. And then I've been in a communications role for about the past 7 years, maybe, more communications role. But for the past 3 years, I've been researching, mostly full-time, researching the history of Johnnie Walker and writing it. It was written during lockdown. Lockdown has some advantages if you have to write a book, as I'm sure Dave would probably agree as well. And we published it about three or four weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And I think I'd just make the point about the book. It's not just the history of Johnnie Walker. I mean, I had some things that I really wanted to say about the history of Scotch and the way Scotch whiskey in the industry developed as well. So they're in the book. Some bits are more obvious than others. Some are maybe hidden away. But it's really a book about how one brand develops, but how the category is developing sort of around it, in front of it and behind it.
Yeah, and I think what now we've kind of got the introduction to you, what I'd like to try and do now is kind of go back to the discussion we were having with Dave and bounce it between yourself, Dave, and Sam, because I think you three, and obviously we've got Dave Worthington in as well, if he wants to join in, because I think between you four, it's going to be a far better bounce around than us trying to ask questions. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to go back to Dave on this point now and kind of get back into where we were saying, you know, we're back in the 1820s. You know, we know the distillers and the companies are looking, it's all about profit. It always will be about profit, but it's still about producing good whiskey.
Yeah, of course. You know, it's, and I think that's often it's often overlooked, not within this august gathering. You know, and everybody knows about things such as distillery character, etc., etc. But I think, you know, to move that comment on, I think it is often overlooked, I think, in these kind of malt-centric days, about how important, how that paradigm exists within all distilleries. So although you don't see Glenlossie or Marachmore as frontline single malts, it doesn't mean that you know, they take any less or pay any less attention to character and quality than a frontline single malt. So that's, you know, I think the lens that we have of, you know, blends, malts, amazing, and, you know, all single malts, you know, absolutely phenomenal. I think we have to kind of redress that balance as well, because every distiller, to the best of my experience, cares passionately about the whiskey that they make. And, you know, you go to any distillery and speak to the people working in that distillery, and they will believe they are making the best spirit in the world. And that's a really, really important thing to emphasize, you know, especially to, you know, as all of us begin to talk to new whiskey drinkers and people who are unfamiliar with the intricacies of the whiskey, the industry, is that it is made by people. It's made by people who deeply, deeply care about what they are making. And just because you don't know a distillery doesn't mean that it doesn't, you know, for some reason the quality standards have slipped.
Yeah, and I mean that's an interesting thing when, you know, with Sam being at Balvenie and Glenfiddich and that. I mean, working for companies that are pretty big, I'm pretty sure you saw the passion within them distilleries as well, Sam.
Yeah, it was always an inspiring opportunity to be able to spend time with any of the craftspeople up at the distillery. The most striking feature of which being that they all took the whiskey very seriously, but none of them took themselves seriously. So they were always fucking about, always taking the mickey of one another, playing pranks, telling stories, regaling guests. It was all about the fun and the experience and the warmth that was just naturally exuded from them. But when it came to the juice they were making, they cared massively, and they focused collectively on optimizing it all the time. When I first started there was a woman named Marie Stanton who was the head distiller, head of the site really, and the way she motivated her team to all give a fuck was inspiring. I don't know if it's a normal thing at every distillery, but certainly at Balvenie, everyone cross-functionally. So if you were a mashman, you cared about distillation. If you were in the still room, you cared about the warehouse. Everyone was sort of involved in everything else, which was, I learned later, not as normal as I came to believe.
Which, I mean, that emphasizes exactly what Dave said earlier, in the fact of the important thing is the people. It's, you know, the people making it kind of make the whiskey. And I don't mean the obvious, they make the whiskey, you know, that they make the tales, they make the stories, that they're what make the whiskey kind of come to life.
Well, there's that word throwing around. John Glazer, I think, has used it for a couple of years. And I think I heard Jim Beveridge use it with the team of blenders at Johnny Walker as well, about social terroir.
That Becky started using that over the last 48 hours as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Becky wrote a piece, didn't she, for Club? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So that term has been thrown around a bit, and trying to define what that actually means, but that's just putting credit, rather than in the soil or in the grapes or in the barley or whatever, that element of terroir, the fingerprint of the maker, which kind of makes sense, or makers, which I suppose makes sense if there's a collective ambition rather than just profit.
And I mean,
one of the things about making whiskey is that it's all about interventions. It's all about human interventions, from, if you want to take it right back to the field and choices of barley varieties, then you can, but certainly once you get into the maltings and beyond, it's all about what people do. So I mean, to that extent, social terroir is a sort of meaningful thing. Obviously with Jim Beveridge and the blenders, they take it all the way through to producing blends, because you're making whiskey sort of up until the time it goes into a black label bottle or whatever it might be. But I think it's, you know, when people try and claim so much for terroir as this thing of great purity or whatever people think it is, I mean, I some people maybe heard me say this before, but I think using the word terroir in whiskey making is totally wrong. It's a form of cultural appropriation of the worst possible kind, actually. And I would go the same with vintage and Grand Cru, you know, all that stuff. It's not whiskey language. We don't need that. We've got a strong language of our own, you know.
I mean, I think the thing that would answer the, you know, some things that are thrown about. I mean, obviously yourself, you work for probably the biggest spirits company in the world with diageo.
No, I work for, no, probably about it. I work for the biggest spirits company in the world. For 3 more weeks, in case anyone wants to know. So
right. Well, while you're still there, then we'll say. So basically, obviously, you're working for the biggest whiskey company in the world. And some things that have been thrown about is that, you know, a lot of people within Diageo don't care as much as other people. And I think that's where it comes across as wrong, that, you know, you see the passion you yourself have got, and you see I mean, I've gone around a few distilleries that are owned by Diageo, and they care as much as anybody else.
Yeah, and I think it's, I think sometimes people who like to write about these things on social media, and I did see a weird thread on one of the Facebook groups, which had started off with someone saying, well, which distilleries produce the bad whiskey that goes into blends or something. That was sort of where it started. Huge sort of amount of ill-informed comment. But I think people don't realize just how personally hurt people can be at distilleries when ill-informed and ill-considered things are said about the whiskies that they produce. I mean, people, and Dave and Sam will know this very, very well, people take it really personally. They take it really personally. And it's one thing, you know, and probably quite justified for people to have a crack at a big corporate giant and all the rest of it. But when it gets down to what someone's been doing maybe for 20, 30 years of their life, you know, you need to think twice before some of the things that people might say